So I wanted to make a quick little video here, and I've created sort of a chart here that we're going to utilize in class, but might be a good strategy to help you remember the 20 hormones that I've asked you to think about. Now I've highlighted those 20 in red here. There's others that we're going to talk about, but these are not ones that at this point you are responsible for understanding for your fundamentals quiz. So one of the things I wanted to highlight is a way to sort of think about the organization here, and then it might be helpful again if we try to remember some of the numbers that we have here, is I've sort of grouped these as how we're going to learn them with these Hp axes. So the H standing for hypothalamus, the P standing for pituitary, and then there's 4 of these axes that we're going to discuss, 3 that we'll kind of spend a little bit more time on, 2 in particular here. So I'm just going to kind of go and highlight first what these axes are, and then maybe we can use that as a framework to help us think about the different hormones that we have here. So over on the left here is going to be one that we're going to spend the least kind of amount of time talking about. This is what we call the Hps axis. Okay, so the hypothalamus, pituitary, that's always what the P stands for, but then the X is going to be something different. And in this situation, this S as X is going to refer to the growth hormone, somatotropin. So that's what that S stands for. The next one that we're going to talk about is the Hpa axis. So that's kind of this guy right here. And again, the H and the P stand for the hypothalamus and the pituitary again. We'll talk about the hormones and neurotransmitters that are released there. But the Hpa axis, the A refers to the fact that the downstream kind of sort of organ that we're targeting are the adrenal glands. So next, we're going to have the Hpt axis, and again, this time the T stands for thyroid. So let's see, pick a different color here, Hpt for our thyroid. And then the last axis is going to be Hpg for gonads. So if we sort of remember that we've got these 4 sort of axes that we're going to talk about, that can be a way to sort of start to categorize our different hormones that we need to study. So now that we've outlined these different HPX axes, I want to use that as a framework to help us just think about the different hormones that you need to know. And again, we're going to spend some more time in class talking about these different axes. But we'll start with the hypothalamus because that's kind of where things start in terms of chemical signaling when we think about these pathways. So there's 3 hormones that are kind of in the middle here that I've asked you to kind of think about, but they're not necessarily part of these axes. And so if we want to remember the number 4 for hypothalamus, that's actually not the 4 hormones right now that we have in our axes, but there's 4 hormones total. So oxytocin and vasopressin are 2 small peptides that are produced in the hypothalamus. And then dopamine is derived from tryptophan, which is why there's a W there. But these guys, again, are in the hypothalamus. And then we also have Corticotropin-Releasing Hormone. So one of the things that we'll talk about as a way to remember the different kinds of hormones, so again, I am going to ask you to think about these different kinds of hormones, not in a way that you'll need to think about for your fundamentals quiz, but for your exam, I am going to ask you to think about these different axes. And so all of the hypothalamic hormones have this releasing hormone sort of part to it. And what the previous part has to do with, okay, this is going to be a signal from the hypothalamus that causes the release of growth hormone, which is what is released then in the pituitary gland. Or it might have some information about what's released kind of downstream from that. So we've got growth hormone releasing hormone that's going to stimulate the pituitary gland to secrete growth hormone, and then sort of a downstream effector of that is in the liver. Insulin-like growth factor is going to respond to growth hormone and be released by the liver. So again, all of this at the end of the day is going to stimulate growth. When we think about the Hpa axis that we have here, we're going to have corticotropin-releasing hormone. So again, this helps us remember that it's really responsible for the secretion of cortisol at the end of the day. So corticotropin-releasing hormone is going to stimulate the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone in the pituitary gland. So again, reminding us not only is it cortisol, but it's going to be adrenaline as well. So those again are very two important adrenal hormones, and that's our fight or flight response. So again, stimulation of the Hpa axis is going to lead to sort of a stress response or a fight or flight response. Hpt Axis, this is one of the hormones that you do need to know here, this thyrotropin releasing hormone. So again, this is going to get the thyrotropin hormone to be released from the pituitary gland. So TRH is going to stimulate the production of TSH in the pituitary, and that's going to cause the thyroid to produce both T4 and T3. T4, again, is the drug form that we see for thyroid hormone, but T3 is sort of the bioactive form. And interestingly enough, most of the T3 is actually produced in peripheral tissues by the conversion of T4 to T3. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in class. So again, this Hpt axis is responsible for sort of regulating your metabolic set point. And lastly, your HPG axis, G standing for the gonadal tissue, has the hypothalamus releasing gonadotropic releasing hormone. And then that is going to stimulate the production of both luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone from the pituitary gland. And these are going to act on the ovaries and the testes to produce estrogen as the primary hormone in the ovaries, and then testosterone as the primary hormone in the testes. One thing to highlight is that both of these are produced from progesterone. So progesterone is produced in gonadal tissue, and that is then converted into estrogen and testosterone in the respective tissues. Not part of kind of this diagram here, but I should sort of highlight, and we'll just kind of draw an arrow here, that some of these are also produced in the adrenal gland. So the adrenal gland is also responsible for producing some estrogen and testosterone, specifically in kind of the opposite sex species. So producing estrogen in males and testosterone in females. So obviously not as much as produced in gonadal tissue for kind of the matched sex sort of situation there. So hopefully that's a little bit of a way to help kind of compartmentalize the hormones that you needed to know that were part of these axes, and that really represents about 15 of the hormones that you need to know. Now the other hormones are kind of related here, and so I've kind of got them grouped accordingly. When we think about glucose homeostasis, we think about glucagon and insulin and their production in the pancreas. And so why I've got these sort of under this HPS axis is sort of managing your fuel in terms of glucose homeostasis is really important for regulating growth. So the fact that this is an insulin-like growth factor kind of ties in with the hormones glucagon and insulin here. So two hormones, again, produced in the pancreas. And then three hormones that we have here that are sort of what I call singles. They're produced in one gland. They're really not tied to anything else that we've talked about here in terms of the hypothalamus, pituitary, or their downstream effector glands. But again, the pineal gland is responsible for producing melatonin. A lot of the serotonin in your body is actually produced in your intestines, and not really a hormone per se as much as involved in this process is acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, a primary neurotransmitter that's produced in neuronal vesicles. So again, hopefully a nice sort of way to maybe see these hormones in a different light. I think a lot of people are doing quite well at understanding maybe what the hormone does, but in terms of understanding where it's produced, there was a lot of confusion, particularly as we think of so many of these that are produced in different regions of the brain.